The snow didn't just fall that winter, it came to bury secrets. And the first secret it wanted was Jedediah Boonhart. They called him the Old Bear of the Mountain, a relic, a curse. The town he'd built with his own 2 hands had spat him out, told him to go die in the woods. They said he was too old, his hands shook, his mind was gone. A liability, a ghost from a time they wanted to forget. So he went. He pressed his great shoulders against the wind and walked back into the wilderness that had been his first home. He left the warm glow of the town hall, the sneering faces, the laughter of children who had learned to mock him. He left it all behind and walked into a silence so deep it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. He was a giant of a man, even with his back curved by years of labor. His beard was a crust of white frost, his eyes the color of a winter sky. He'd raised their barns, cleared their roads, broken their wildest horses. His body was a map of the town's history, every scar a memory of its foundation. But memories don't keep you warm, and respect doesn't fill your belly. In the woods, he was just an old man. He built weak fires that sputtered against the vast, swallowing cold. He swung his axe until his arms screamed with fire, the familiar weight feeling foreign and heavy. He laid his body on worn pelts, staring up at stars that seemed colder and more distant than he remembered. His hands, the same hands that could frame a house or gentle a mustang, now trembled when he tried to light a match. The wolves howled at night, their calls echoing through the timber. They were strong. They were vital. They had a place in the world. Jedediah, he was just old. That one word, spat at him by Marshall Virgil Tate, echoed louder than any wolf's cry. Your time has passed, Jed. Go back to your hills. He tried to fish through holes in the ice, his breath a white cloud in the frigid air. When a trout slipped from his clumsy frozen fingers, he didn't curse the fish. He cursed himself. He cursed the years. He cursed the body that had finally betrayed him. But he did not die. Each morning, the sun rose, and he rose with it, another day of silence, another day of failure. Memories were his only company, and they were cruel. He saw the faces of men he'd worked beside, men who now turned their eyes away. He saw the smiles of women who'd once admired his strength, women who now whispered of curses when he passed. What does a man become when the world decides he's worthless? It was hunger that finally broke him, a raw, gnawing hunger that overshadowed the cold and the loneliness. His traps were empty. The snow was too deep. The roots he'd stored were buried under an impenetrable blanket of white. He slung his axe over his back and began the long walk down from the hills. He told himself he would just buy flour and salt. He wouldn't linger. He wouldn't look anyone in the eye. He would be a ghost, just as they wanted. But the closer he got to the town, the louder the scornful voices echoed in his head. The town lay quiet under the snow, chimneys breathing smoke into the gray sky. It looked peaceful, but Jedediah knew better. He knew the judgment that hid behind those barred doors and shuttered windows. He paused at the town well, the ice thick around its edges. He could feel their eyes on him already. He was a stain on their perfect winter landscape. Then a voice cut through the silence, soft and clear. You must be cold. He turned, every muscle tense. And there she was, Annalise Hartwell. He remembered her vaguely. A young woman, not yet 30, with dark hair tucked under a simple bonnet. Her husband had died from a fever the year before, leaving her a widow in a town that had little room for solitary women. Her face was pale from the winter, her hands chapped and red from work. But her eyes held none of the fear or disgust he was used to. There was no pity. There was only recognition, as if she was seeing a man, not a relic. She drew a bucket of water from the well with a practiced motion, the rope groaning in protest. She offered it to him. Her mitten brushed his knuckles, a fleeting touch of warmth in the biting cold. And then she said the words that would change everything. 4 simple words that struck him harder than any fist.
I am here for you. Jedediah froze. The water trembled in the bucket he held. He could feel the eyes again, more of them now. Shutters creaked open. Curtains were pulled aside. Across the street, Clint Rowley, the ranch foreman whose heart was as bitter as the winter wind, leaned against a post, a sneer twisting his lips. The whispers had already begun. He knew it. This single act of kindness was a declaration of war against the town's cold judgment. He should have refused.
He should have turned and walked away, back to the lonely silence of his hills. But he was so thirsty. He drank the water, the cold liquid a shock to his system. It felt like fire and ice all at once. When he handed the bucket back, his voice was rough gravel. You shouldn't have. Annalise met his gaze without flinching. Kindness is not a crime, Jedediah. But in that town, it was the next thing to it. And the trial was about to begin. Martha Glay was the first to cast a stone. Her tongue, sharp as an icicle, spread the story through the mercantile, through the church pews, through every gathering of gossiping women. That Hartwell girl, she'd hiss, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. Lost her senses completely, taking up with that old mountain brute. Doesn't she know he's cursed? Cursed. There was that word again. It clung to him like frost, a story the town told itself to justify its cruelty. By evening, the story of Annalise and the well had grown wings. By morning, it was a monster. Even the children had learned the new refrain, their voices piping and cruel as he passed the blacksmith's forge. Old bear, the widow's your snare. He gritted his teeth and walked on, the weight of their scorn a physical burden. That night, back in the solitude of his lean-to, he couldn't get her words out of his head. I am here for you. It was a simple phrase, but it held a warmth that his pathetic fire couldn't provide. It scared him more than the wolves, more than the hunger. He had lived in exile for so long, he'd forgotten what human warmth felt like. He didn't know if he could trust it, but he couldn't forget the look in her eyes. There was no mockery, no agenda, just a quiet strength that seemed to defy the whole world. The snow deepened, the storms howled, and Jedediah found himself drawn to the edges of town more and more often. He told himself it was just for supplies, but he was lying. He was drawn by the memory of that one moment of kindness. He would watch her from a distance, a shadow among the pines. He saw her chopping her own firewood, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He saw her struggling to carry heavy sacks of feed from the mercantile. He saw the loneliness that clung to her like a second coat. One night, he saw that her fence had collapsed under the weight of a heavy snowfall. He waited until the moon was high and the town was asleep. Then, he crept down from the hills. His old muscles protested, but he worked with a quiet, methodical purpose. He cut new posts from a fallen pine, his axe making barely a sound. He set them deep in the frozen ground, his breath misting in the air. He repaired the fence, making it stronger than before. He was gone before the first hint of dawn, his tracks already being covered by a fresh layer of snow. He didn't know if she would know it was him. But the next day, from his vantage point in the trees, he saw her stop and stare at the repaired fence. And for a moment, he thought he saw her smile. It was a dangerous game. The more he lingered, the more the town bristled. They saw his secret acts of service not as kindness, but as a predator stalking its prey. Clint Raleigh made sure of that. He cornered Annalise outside the mercantile one afternoon, his voice a low, menacing growl. You'd best mind your place, widow, he said, blocking her path. Folks around here don't like you keeping company with that relic. He brings bad luck. Annalise clutched her sack of flour, her knuckles white. But she didn't back down. She stood up straight, her small frame radiating a defiance that infuriated Clint. Better company with him than with cowards, she said, her voice clear and steady. Then she pushed past him and walked away, leaving him sputtering in her wake. The story spread like wildfire. Annalise Hartwell had chosen her side. She had sided with the outcast, and the town would not forgive her for it. Jedediah wrestled with himself. He knew he should leave. He knew his presence was putting her in danger, painting a target on her back. He was poison, and she was drinking it willingly. But the thought of returning to the absolute silence, to the cold, empty days, and the lonely, wolf-haunted nights, it was a thought worse than death. His body was failing, that much was true. But his heart, stubborn and foolish, beat a little stronger every time he thought of her. A few nights later, the snow was falling thick and fast, a blinding curtain of white. He saw her at the well again, struggling to pull up the heavy, ice-crusted bucket. This time, he didn't hesitate. He didn't think about the prying eyes or the gossiping tongues. He stepped out of the shadows and took the rope from her hands. He pulled, his old strength surging through him. The bucket came up as if it weighed nothing. She looked up at him, her face illuminated by the faint glow of a nearby lantern. Snowflakes melted in her dark hair. "They will not stop talking," she whispered, her breath a white plume in the cold air. He looked down at her, at the fierce resolve in her eyes. And for the first time in a long, long time, he didn't feel like a relic. He felt like a man. "Then let them talk," he answered. The words hung in the air between them, a promise and a challenge. He saw something shift in her expression, a flicker of surprise, of hope. He had spent so long being silent, accepting his fate. She had never expected him to fight back, and in that moment, something ignited inside him. A tiny spark in the cold, dead ashes of his spirit. A memory of the man he used to be, the man who didn't back down. But as he turned and walked away, the snow swallowing his footprints behind him, he saw a shadow detach itself from the corner of the saloon. Clint Raleigh. His eyes were narrowed, his lips curled into a snarl of pure contempt. The storm of gossip was about to become a blizzard of hate. Jedediah knew it. He stood at the center of it, with no shield but the memory of a kind word and the steadfast gaze of a lonely widow. That night, his small fire seemed to burn a little brighter. The voices of rejection were still there, clawing at the edges of his mind. But another voice was there now, too. Softer, yet infinitely stronger. "I am here for you." He closed his eyes. The winter was far from over. But for the first time, he felt the fragile, flickering warmth of hope. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that it was something worth fighting for. The town's animosity was a physical thing now, a suffocating pressure that followed Jedediah everywhere. He was no longer just an outcast. He was a symbol of Annalise's defiance, and for that, they hated him even more. He had started doing small, unseen labors for others in the town. A stack of firewood left on the porch of the elderly widow McNulty. A brace of rabbits laid silently on the church steps for the pastor's family. He never left a note, never waited for thanks. It wasn't for them, it was for him. It was a way to prove to the gnawing voice of doubt inside him that his hands could still create and provide, not just tremble and fail. But the town twisted even these small gifts into something sinister. Martha Glay swore he was stealing the wood from one neighbor to give to another. Others claimed the rabbits were diseased, a part of his mountain curse meant to bring sickness into their homes. They said he was trying to buy his way back in, or worse, trying to indebt Annalise to him with these public displays of false charity. Annalise heard the whispers. She saw the cold shoulders, the way mothers pulled their children away when she walked by. The mercantile owner started double-checking her credit, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. She was being exiled right alongside him, yet she never wavered. One morning, Jedediah was reinforcing a loose post on her fence when she opened her cabin door. The scent of coffee and wood smoke drifted out, a small pocket of warmth in the frozen world. "Come in, Jedediah," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a simple statement of fact. He hesitated, his hand on his axe. He was keenly aware of the eyes watching from the road. "They'll see." She stepped out onto the porch, a steaming mug in her hand. She pressed it into his gloved fingers. Her voice was low, but firm. "You mend the fence. I will mend the silence." So he stayed outside, the warmth of the mug seeping into his bones. He hammered the rails with a steady, rhythmic beat, each strike a small act of defiance. He could feel their stares. He saw Clint Raleigh ride by on his horse, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the snow near the fence line. He heard him mutter, loud enough to carry, "Old fools playing house." Jedediah's jaw tightened, but his hammer blows remained steady. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing his anger, or his shame. He was just a man, fixing a fence. That evening brought a more official form of condemnation. Marshal Virgil Tate's broad shadow fell across her doorway, long after Jedediah had retreated to the hills. Annalise told him about it the next day, her voice quiet, but her eyes still flashing with anger. "He told me if I tie myself to you, I'll be tied to your exile," she recounted. "He said the town has no place for relics." Jedediah's heart sank. This was what he had feared. He was dragging her down with him. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She met his gaze directly. "I told him I'd rather have exile with truth than safety with cruelty." The marshal had just shaken his head and walked away, his heavy boots crunching on the pristine snow. But his warning lingered in the air like a death sentence. For days, Jedediah stayed away. He fought a war within himself, pacing the frozen ground under the silent pines. The decent thing to do was to disappear, to let her rebuild her life without the stain of his presence, to let the town forget her act of rebellion. But every night, as he huddled by his fire, he saw her face. He saw her standing in that doorway, a lone woman against the world, defending an old broken man. He couldn't abandon that. He couldn't let her fight alone. He was old, yes, but maybe even a relic still had one good fight left in him. Hunger and a stubborn heart kept drawing him back. Their meetings were brief, their words few, but a powerful unspoken language grew between them. She would hand him a loaf of freshly baked bread, still warm, and his simple nod of acceptance spoke volumes of gratitude. He would leave a perfectly stacked pile of kindling by her door, and the smile she gave him from her window was brighter than any lantern. It was a fragile piece, a small bubble of warmth in a world of ice, and the town was determined to burst it. Clint Raleigh had been nursing his hatred with whiskey at the saloon. His resentment for Jedediah was an old, festering wound, and Annalise's defiance had torn it wide open. "He skulks around like a wolf," Clint slurred to the knot of men gathered around him, their faces grim in the flickering lamplight. "And we just let him? Let him circle what's ours? That widow's already half bewitched by him." He painted Jedediah as a menace, a drain, a ghost clinging to a life that had long since moved on. He spoke of the curse, hinting at old tragedies, at shadows from the town's past that Jedediah was somehow responsible for. Drink loosened their tongues and hardened their hearts. When Martha Glay scurried past the saloon, she peered in, saw the angry faces, and let out a sharp, bird-like cackle of approval that spurred them on. By the time the saloon doors swung shut for the night, their drunken contempt had solidified into a plan. It was no longer just about whispers and scorn. It was about action. 2 nights later, Jedediah came down for flour. The wind was a razor, slicing at any exposed skin. He clutched the precious sack to his chest, his head down, wanting only to get what he needed and retreat. But he felt the eyes before he saw the men. Shadows detached themselves from the saloon's porch. Boots crunched in the snow, a grim, unified sound. Clint Raleigh was at their head, a wide, malicious grin splitting his face. Behind him stood 3 other men, their shoulders hunched against the cold, their expressions a mixture of drunkenness and cruelty. "Evening, old bear," Clint drawled, his voice thick with false cheer. "Carrying off what ain't yours again?" Jedediah didn't break his stride. He kept his eyes fixed on the path back to the hills. "Step aside, Clint." His voice was low, a rumbling warning. But they didn't move. They fanned out, circling him. The street lantern cast long, dancing shadows, turning them into monstrous figures. The accusations started flying, sharp and fast. Thief, madman, curse, burden. Each word was a stone, and he was their target. Clint stepped forward and shoved him hard. The sack of flour flew from Jedediah's grasp, bursting open on the ground. The white powder billowed into the air like a pale, mocking ghost. Jedediah staggered, catching his balance. But he didn't raise his hands. His heart hammered against his ribs, a wild drumbeat in the frozen silence. He would not give them the excuse. He would not swing first. The first punch came anyway. Clint's fist slammed into his jaw, snapping his head back. The stars overhead blurred. Another fist drove into his ribs, stealing his breath. The other men closed in. Doors opened along the street. People peered out, drawn by the sounds of violence. A crowd began to gather, their faces pale ovals in the darkness, watching in silence. No one stepped forward to help. No one called for the marshal. They just watched. A boot caught him in the side. He grunted, the pain a white-hot flash. Laughter mixed with the jeers. He tried to stay on his feet, his pride a stubborn anchor. But his legs were old and tired. His knees buckled, and he went down into the snow, the ground cold and hard beneath him. The flour mingled with the dirt, stained by the blood dripping from his lip. And that's when a voice cut through the brutal chaos. It was sharp, trembling with rage, but absolutely unyielding. "Enough, Annalise." She tore through the circle of men, her small body a force of nature. She threw herself between them and Jedediah, flinging her arms wide as if to shield him with her own body. Her bonnet had fallen off, her dark hair spilling around her shoulders. Her eyes blazed in the lantern light, fierce and full of a fire that seemed to hold the entire mob at bay. "Shame on you!" she cried, her voice ringing down the silent street. "All of you, beating an old man in the snow! Is this what you've become? Is cruelty your new badge of honor?" The men hesitated, their fists lowering. Their drunken courage faltered under the intensity of her gaze. But Clint just sneered. He took a step forward, raising his hand as if to strike her. "Best stand aside, widow," he snarled, "lest you want to share his exile." Her answer was immediate, hurled back at him like a burning spear. "Then exile me, too." She knelt in the snow, in the dirt, and the blood and the flour. She curved her body protectively over Jedediah's, her small hands pressing against his bruised and bleeding shoulder. Her voice broke, but the words were as strong as steel. "I am here for you." A profound silence fell over the street. The words echoed, carried on the wind, slapping against the shuttered windows. Even the silent watchers in the doorways seemed to shrink back. In the distance, Marshal Tate stood in the shadows, his face a grim, unreadable mask. Jedediah felt the pressure of her hands, the impossible warmth of her defiance, and something deep inside him, something that had been beaten down and buried for years, stirred. It was the last ember of the man he once was, fanned into a flame by her courage. With a deep groan that was equal parts pain and fury, he began to push himself up. He got to one knee, then the other. He rose to his full height, blood streaking his white beard, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He towered over them all, bent and broken, but still a mountain of a man. The crowd instinctively shuffled back. His voice, when it came, was hoarse and raw, but it rolled over them with the force of an avalanche. "You call me Relic," he began, his eyes sweeping over their faces, landing on Clint, on the marshal, on the silent neighbors. You call me curse, burden. You see the years etched on my face and you think they are chains. He took a staggering step forward. But these hands, he said, holding them up, gnarled and bloodied. These hands built your barns when you had nothing but open sky for a roof. These arms hauled the timber for your church. This back bore the stones for your foundations when you were too young or too weak to bear them yourselves. He pointed a trembling finger toward the well. You drink from wells I dug. You walk on roads I cleared. You live in a town that I helped carve out of the wilderness with my own sweat and blood. And now you spit on me because time has done its work? The words struck them harder than any punch. Men lowered their eyes, suddenly fascinated by their own boots. The cold wind no longer carried their laughter, only the heavy, suffocating weight of their shame. Even Clint's sneer began to falter, the truth of Jedediah's words chipping away at his drunken rage. Jedediah's chest heaved, his strength nearly gone, but he had one last thing to say. I may be old, he roared, his voice cracking, but I am not gone. I am not nothing, and I will not crawl back into those hills to die simply because you have forgotten the debt you owe to those who came before you. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, slowly, as if a spell had been broken, the crowd began to melt away. One by one, in pairs, they turned their backs and shuffled back into the warmth of their homes, unwilling to meet his fiery gaze. They left Clint and his cronies standing alone in the middle of the street. Annalise's hand found his. It was trembling, but her grip was firm. She held it not in secret, but right there, in the open, for anyone left to see. I'm here for you, she whispered again, and this time, it was not just a promise to him. It was a declaration to the world. He looked down at her, at the fierce, unwavering loyalty in her tear-streaked face. And though every inch of his body screamed in pain, something inside him lifted. It was a feeling stronger than shame, stronger than exile. It was dignity. He was not alone. But just as the last of the cronies began to slink away, Clint Raleigh, his face purple with fury and humiliation, let out a primal scream. Forgotten! He shrieked, his voice cracking with a pain that went deeper than whiskey. I haven't forgotten anything. It's you who forgets, old man. You forget the price we paid for this town. You forget the sound of the avalanche. Jedediah stiffened. Annalise looked from Clint's tormented face to Jedediah's suddenly ashen one. The air grew thick with a tension far older than a winter's night brawl. You forget my father! Clint screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Jedediah. You left him to die on that mountain. That's your curse! You let him die! The secret was out. It wasn't just about being old. This hatred was personal. It was a story of death, of blame, and of a secret Jedediah had carried in silence for 20 years. The town's cruelty suddenly had a source, a dark, poisoned spring that had been bubbling just beneath the surface all along. Marshal Tate finally stepped out of the shadows, his face grim. The beating was over. The real trial was just beginning. Jedediah stood in the snow, the accusation hanging in the frozen air like a shroud. The story of the avalanche was the town's founding myth, and its greatest tragedy. A prospecting party, led by Jedediah and Clint's father, Thomas Raleigh, had been caught in a sudden, violent slide. Only Jedediah had returned. He'd come back, half dead himself, with a story of a freak accident, of a heroic effort to save the others that had failed. The town had accepted it, mostly. But a seed of doubt, planted by a grieving, bitter son, had taken root. Over the years, that seed had grown into the poisonous vine of the Jedediah curse. Any misfortune, any bad harvest, any harsh winter, was laid at his door. He was the man who had survived when better men had died. Now, the accusation was no longer a whisper. It was a roar in the center of the street. I never left him, Jedediah said, his voice quiet. heavy with the weight of 2 decades of silence. Liar! Clint spat. You came back alone. You saved yourself and you left him buried in the snow. That's not what happened, Jedediah said, his eyes finding Marshall Tate's in the darkness. And you know it, Virgil. The Marshal's face, usually a mask of stern neutrality, flickered with something else. Conflict. He took a slow step forward. Clint, that's enough. Go home. Not until he tells the truth, Clint insisted, his grief and rage making him reckless. Tell them how you were the leader, how it was your job to keep them safe. Tell them how you ran. I didn't run. Jedediah's voice grew stronger, shaking off the pain of his injuries, fueled by an old, righteous anger. Your father. Thomas was a good man, but he was a proud man. He saw a vein of gold, high up on the ridge. I told him it was too dangerous. The snow was unstable. I begged him not to go. The few remaining townspeople drew closer, their earlier shame replaced by a morbid curiosity. This was the story they had only ever heard in whispers. He wouldn't listen, Jedediah continued, his gaze locked on Clint. He called me a coward, said I was trying to keep the glory for myself. He took 2 other men and went up the ridge, against my direct warning. I didn't follow him to his death, son. I followed him to try and save him from his own foolish pride. A gasp went through the small crowd. This was not the story they knew. The snow gave way, just as I feared, Jedediah said, his voice thick with memory. It happened so fast. A sound like thunder, and the whole world turned white. I was thrown clear, but they were buried. I dug for 3 days, Clint. My hands were raw, bleeding stumps. I screamed their names until my voice was gone. I found the other 2. They were already gone. But I never found him. I never found your father. Clint stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. No, you're lying. You're trying to blame him. I am telling the truth I should have told 20 years ago, Jedediah said, turning his gaze back to the Marshal. I kept silent out of respect for your father's memory, Clint. I didn't want his last act on this earth to be remembered as one of foolishness. I told the town it was a tragic accident, that we were all caught together. I let them believe I was just the lucky one, the cursed one. I carried that burden so your father could be remembered as a hero. Silence. A deep, profound silence, broken only by the soft hiss of the falling snow. Annalise squeezed Jedediah's hand, her eyes shining with tears. Marshall Tate finally spoke, his voice heavy with resignation. He's telling the truth, Clint. I was just a deputy then. I was part of the recovery party Jedediah led back up the mountain a week later. We saw the tracks. We saw where Thomas and the others had gone, against all common sense. Jedediah made me swear to keep the secret, to protect the Raleigh name. The foundation of Clint's lifelong hatred crumbled into dust. The curse, the whispers, the town's collective shunning, it was all built on a lie. A lie Jedediah had told out of kindness, and a lie the town had embraced out of fear and suspicion. Clint staggered back, his face white. The malice was gone, replaced by a raw, gaping wound of confusion and shame. He looked at the old man he had just beaten, the man he had hated his entire life, and saw not a monster, but a man who had borne a terrible burden in silence. I didn't know, he stammered, the words barely audible. No, Jedediah said, his voice softening, all the anger gone, replaced by a deep, ancient weariness. You didn't. It was a weight I chose to carry alone. Maybe that was my mistake. Marshall Tate stepped forward, his duty reasserting itself. He looked not at Jedediah, but at Clint and the men who had stood with him. The truth is out now, he said, his voice like iron. But that doesn't excuse what happened here tonight. Assault is still assault. He grabbed Clint's arm, his grip unyielding. Clint didn't resist. He seemed to have shrunk, all the fight gone out of him. The other men, seeing the marshal's face, began to back away, disappearing into the shadows from which they had come. The street was suddenly empty, save for the three of them standing in the snow. The drama was over. The whispers had been silenced by a truth as loud as an avalanche. Jedediah watched them go, the marshal leading a broken Clint Raleigh toward the town jail. He felt the pain in his ribs, the sting of the cuts on his face. But the heavier weight, the one he had carried on his soul for 20 years, was finally gone. Snow continued to fall, quiet and cleansing, as if trying to cover the ugliness of the night, to offer a fresh start. The town would have to reckon with itself now, with its own cruelty and its willingness to believe a lie. There would be no easy forgiveness. Trust once shattered is not so easily mended. But as Jedediah stood there, leaning on Annalise, her strength holding him up, he no longer felt like an exile. He was no longer a relic. He was just a man who had survived the storm. "Let's get you home," Annalise whispered, her voice soft. He looked down at her, then at her small cabin, its window glowing with a warm, welcoming light. For the first time in a very long time, he knew she wasn't talking about his cold, lonely shelter in the hills. She was talking about a place where he belonged. The winter would not end soon, but a fire had been lit, and with her by his side, he knew no blizzard could ever quench it. If you were moved by Jedediah's story of resilience and the unexpected power of kindness, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You never know what secrets are hiding just beneath the snow.